Okay, so hi everybody. Tonight we are going to be having Jeff Halper here. He is the co-founder of the Israeli Coalition Against Demolitions, and he's going to be talking about where he thinks the Israel-Palestine conflict is heading. It should be a really interesting topic, and then afterwards we'll have like a little Q&A session where you guys, everybody can ask questions. And all right, thank you.
Well, it's good to be back. I mean, the older people remember me. The younger people were 12 when I was here last. But anyway, thank you for the Students for Justice, the SJP group, for having me here. This is, I think, the second or third time I've spoken here at the campus. Just finished a month-long tour of Canada. And this is my respite, because tomorrow I head off to Boston. So this is my short sleeve day. At any rate, you know, I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against Salsa Operations, which is an Israeli peace and human rights organization that's dedicated to ending the occupation, which used to be a code word for the two-state solution. But I will talk, that's what I want to talk about tonight. It's the end of the two-state solution and where are we going from there. And then, but at the same time, we want to help achieve a just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And here, there's a problem with the left, as we sometimes call ourselves, whether it's the Palestinian left or the American left or the Israeli left. And that is that we tend not to be very proactive actors. We're very good at analysis. We're very good at describing a situation. We're very good at complaining when things go wrong. We're not very good at being proactive and being actors and actually formulating solutions. I think there's something about the left. You look in general where, you might even say progressives, because not everybody's left. But you know, I guess there's, you know, we tend to be a little bit more suspicious of the establishment, of political parties, of the whole way society is run, so we tend to kind of stay out of it. And we don't get our hands dirty with that stuff. And we're always kind of gadflies from the side. But we're not really involved. I mean, not many of us run for Congress, probably because we wouldn't be elected. And so, in a sense, there's a kind of a built-in alienation between us and the system. But at the same time, we're in a bad marriage because we need the governments. What can we? You know, we're the people, and we're civil society. That's our fancy word, our fancy name. And you know, we're not elected. We don't have power. We don't negotiate. We don't sign treaties. That's what governments do. They've arrogated to themselves the right to run our foreign affairs, the right to wage wars in our name, and so on. And they've at least taken for themselves the power to do that. But at the same time, they don't do it well. As you just look at the world and you can see that. In other words, the values important to us, I think, especially people more on the left, which is justice, human rights, international law, liberation, peace, freedom, justice, all those kinds of values are certainly not the values by which governments run their foreign policies. I mean, they're even laughable, the governments. So at the same time that we need the governments, we can't completely stay out of the political game. You know, if we don't assert ourselves, there's all kinds of solutions that the politicians will come up with but they're not going to be workable, just solutions. The solutions are often worse than the problems were. And I think that's true in Israel-Palestine. What I want to argue today, and just to get us kind of thinking ahead, thinking forward a little bit, because I think we're not doing that enough, and that is to look beyond the two-state solution. I'll take 2 minutes to do it because I don't want to spend my time on it. The two-state solution, in my view, is gone. It's dead. It's over. We should stop talking about it. But then the question is, well, okay, then what? I mean, where are we going? And we, on the left, neither the Palestinian left nor the Israeli left or anybody, has really sat down to formulate where are we going. Now, that's in general a problem. You know, we have to do that. But to make it even more urgent and critical, in my view, we have a very short timeline. I think, you know, it's hard to know exactly, but, you know, I think our mistake has been to look at this conflict in a linear way. It's been going on for 100 years, it'll go on for another 100 years, you know, and we pass it on from one generation to the next. I think a linear system can end. It gets stuck. You know, there's a long, I think that's where we've gotten. Certainly the Kerry initiative, I mean, it happened way, way before that, but the Kerry initiative kind of just made it clear to everybody that the two-state solution is gone. We're at a dead end. It's you know, more negotiations are not going to help, and there's not going to be any more negotiations. The occupation is not going to end. Israel's strengthening every day. And the PA is a collaborationist regime. So, you know, Israel has even a Palestinian partner in maintaining the occupation. So of course, if you're in power, you try to sustain the status quo as long as you can. But I think we're getting to the end of that. If we look at these major systems of injustice in the world, you think of South Africa under apartheid. Think of Mubarak in Egypt. You think of the Shah of Iran, the Soviet Union, Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, which a lot of the young people won't remember. These were very strong, you know, strong forces. They were strong governments with armies, and the people were very intimidated, and boom, one day they're gone. Poof, like, you know, as John Kerry would say, poof, they're gone. And, you know, and we're all surprised. Looking back, we can see why they weren't sustainable. But in real time, looking forward, we don't see that. But I think we're getting to the point of collapse. In other words, I think what's holding the, well, I mean, collapse in terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And collapse can take a lot of forms. You know, the whole world is so intertwined and so fragile. I think that the Israel-Palestine conflict is sitting on top of a very particular constellation of forces that are changing. You know, the United States is still a dominant actor militarily. That's really changing. You know, the economic ability of the United States is changing. You know, Europe, you know, Europe is subservient to the United States on this issue. I think that's changing. You know, the Arab world is kind of under these conservative dictatorships. That's changing. A lot of stuff in the Middle East is changing. China is quiet, and over there, that's beginning to change. You know, there's all kinds of movements, like it's like a tectonic plate that's moving, and when it moves, something completely unrelated to the Middle East can reverberate and change. It could be an attack in Iran. It could be something that happens with ISIS or with Al-Qaeda. It could be a meltdown of the Eurozone, Greece, you know, all the revolution that happened in Greece. Could be a meltdown of the American economy in some way. Could be a climate issue somewhere. I mean, there's a million places where this collapse could begin to come from. The most immediate one, that I think is more immediate and more in our realm is the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. I just don't see the Palestinian authorities as being sustained for the long term. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Haaretz newspaper, you know Haaretz is the liberal paper in Israel, and I have to tell you, my son is one of the editors of the Haaretz website here, so I'm proud of that. It's very good, and I'm communicating with him every time I open it up. But just, I think yesterday, the day before yesterday, there was an article where Khalil Shkaki is a Palestinian researcher in Ramallah, has a very respected research institute, did a whole massive study that was reported on the Haaretz, and came to the conclusion that the Palestinian Authority is on the verge of collapse. That it's not going to, he doesn't think it's going to last long either. And you know, it's lost all its credibility among the Palestinians themselves, obviously. The United States and Israel are beginning to withhold, its major source of finance. It's being humiliated. There's a good chance in the election that we're going to have in March, next month, there'll be a more right-wing government in Israel that will actually annex Area C of the West Bank. All kinds of things are happening, and Abu Mazen himself is 80-some years old. So it's just not a sustainable enterprise. Even though Israel and the United States and the Palestinian elites wanted to stay, I just don't see it being sustained. And if the Palestinian Authority collapses, this is what I'm saying, the collapse could happen next month. I mean, the collapse could, it can happen anytime. That opens all kinds of new possibilities that don't exist today. The one-state solution, it's funny, I say this in the university. I say, the one-state solution today is academic. Isn't it interesting? The word academic means irrelevant. Something to think about. But it's academic in the sense that nobody's talking about a one-state solution. We haven't sat down, Israeli left hasn't figured out what that means. The Palestinians haven't formulated a real serious plan for a one-state solution. We certainly haven't done it together. No one's really done it. So it's sort of floating out there as an idea, but it's not a program. And so what would happen if next week this whole situation collapses? Next month, I mean, there's a good chance it could happen next month with the Israeli elections. It collapses, new possibilities open up that don't exist today, like a one-state solution. And we're not ready. We, in the more progressive people, the left, we're not ready. We have nothing to offer. We haven't even sat down to talk about it. In that situation, the bad guys have all their plans in the drawer. When the Shah was overthrown in Iran, it wasn't the progressive forces that took over, even though they were there. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it wasn't the progressive forces that took over. In many cases, in Egypt and everywhere, almost everywhere where these revolutions happen or these collapses happen, and new opportunities emerge, and everybody gets excited. It's an Arab Spring, it's this or that. The bad guys are the ones that have the plans, and we're not ready for it. So I wrote an article that was called "Collapse Without Agency." What is a collapse, and the progressives? So if we want to be serious, not only in ending the occupation, but ensuring that something better emerges, because ending the occupation is half the job. Something worse there's a lot of worse scenarios than we even have today that are possible. If we really are serious about that, we've got to start thinking ahead. And that's what I'd like to just take a couple minutes to do today, is to kind of think about where we could go. So just to, and I don't want to talk too long because we should have discussions and stuff. But anyway, this is the map, as you know, of the two-state solution. I don't have to get into that people here. And not only has Israel rejected the two-state solution, which was accepted by the Palestinian Authority and by the PLO. In other words, the two-state solution is a legitimate solution. It's not fair and it's not just, because the Palestinians that are half the population today in Palestine would only get 22% of their country, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. But back in 1988, the PLO formally accepted the two-state solution. Whether they should have or shouldn't have is an open discussion, but they did. And so the two-state solution is viable. And in fact, the two-state solution, even though it's not fair and just, is still a solution that many Palestinians still accept, even if it's only a stage towards eventually, one unified state. But many accept it because, inadequate as it might be, it's the natural culmination of a national liberation struggle. If you have a national liberation struggle for 100 years, you want self-determination, a state of your own. That's the idea of self-determination. And so even a small state would have been that outcome of the struggle. And I think the Palestinians could have made a goal of this small state. In other words, issue, of course, but tunnels are possible, bridges are possible. As a matter of fact, the Rand Corporation weren't necessarily our friends. The Rand Corporation did a very interesting study that you should look up called the ARC, A-R-C, in which they said, what if the two-state solution, we're not going to get into the politics, is impossible. What if, in fact, this emerged? How could it be made viable? How could the Palestinian state be made viable? And they talked about an arc. They pointed out that the mountain range and the main Palestinian cities and towns follow an arc. It actually begins in the mountains of Haifa, but even if you start in the West Bank, you start in Jenin, and it goes Jenin, Nablus, down through Ramallah, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, and then if you come across this way, you hit Gaza City. So they said if there was an arc, and this arc was a highway, and a fast railway, and an upper fiber communications channel, and a water carrier, and then from that you radiated out, that you could have an infrastructure that could in fact hold this together. And of course it leads to a seaport and an airport. You have borders with Arab countries. There's Jerusalem and Bethlehem, that's not a bad resource for a little country. So I think the Palestinians could have made a go of the two-state solution. And in fact, for many years, that was the solution of the Israeli peace movement. One of our slogans was 2 states for 2 peoples. That was considered very progressive. I mean, now I think most of us on the left don't see it as a solution. And certainly, a lot of us think it's gone anyway. Good or not good, it's sort of gone. I think one reason, though, why the Palestinians, I don't want to represent the Palestinians, but I think one reason why the Palestinians, our partners, especially in the left, haven't moved yet to a one-state solution is because the one-state solution, the one-state solution, well, it depends what kind of one-state solution. I mean, a one-state solution that, which Hamas advocates, and which some people on the left that look at Zionism as settler colonialism, not advocating, but are kind of heading towards the idea that Palestine is like Algeria, and when it's liberated, the Jews go home somewhere. I mean, that idea is out there. But if you take that out, one reason I think why the Palestinian left is having trouble moving to a one-state solution is that it doesn't really give. It's not really a culmination of a liberation struggle. In other words, in a one-state solution, we're locked into one state with our oppressors, with the Israelis. There isn't a Palestinian state, and in a sense, the Palestinian movement would have to transform itself from a national liberation struggle into a civil rights struggle for equal rights in one state. And there's conceptual problems with that. I don't know if the Palestinians are ready. Certainly this generation, my generation and older, aren't able to do that. They're not able to say, we're going to abandon a national liberation struggle and we're going to shift to a civil rights struggle. They really can't do that. And at the same time, I think, at the same time, there's no mechanism to do that. The strategic mechanism of the Palestinian people, of course, was the PLO. That was the framework, and within the PLO, the PNC, the Palestinian National Council, that really did represent Palestinians all over the world. That's gone, or it's moribund at least. As long as Abu Mazen and his friends are around, there's not going to be a functioning PLO. So the whole mechanism by which Palestinians can decide to say, all right, let's have this national discussion. Should we move from national liberation to civil rights is missing. You don't have that. That mechanism is missing. And then, of course, the Palestinians are fragmented intentionally. They're targeted by Israel. So, the PA is artificially propped up. So what you have is a situation where I think a lot of Palestinians feel that the two-state solution is gone, but haven't yet moved to a one-state solution. A lot of our Palestinian partners, from my experience, are stuck kind of in the middle. And that's very dangerous, a very dangerous place to be when this collapse could happen at any time. So they're in a transition, but how long that transition will take and how is it going to work itself out without those mechanisms, strategic mechanisms at work is a question. So there are some Palestinians who are saying it's a generational thing, that we can't move to a one-state solution, and so there'll be a situation, and this is what you're hearing more and more from a lot of Palestinians, there'll be a new generation in the next 10 or 15 years come to maturity for whom the occupation is kind of normalized. In other words, they have kind of forgotten the PLO and Arafat and Intifadas. And there'll be a situation in which they'll wake up, they'll start to wake up and say, well, wait a minute, why do they have voting rights and I don't? Why do they have health care and I? In other words, there'll be organically a kind of a civil rights movement that will emerge, and maybe it's up to the next generation to begin to resolve this. That's kind of where many Palestinians are going that don't see how this generation can really take control of the political situation and move to another solution. So it's a very interesting and problematic political situation for the Palestinians. But certainly I would again say that the two-state solution is gone. So you've got that gap between a Palestinian authority that advocates for this and the reality of the ground. And the reality, of course, is also what I've called, without getting into all this, what I've called the matrix of control. If anybody can tell me how a Palestinian state is going to emerge from this, they should win the Nobel Peace Prize. This is what I call the matrix of control. So Israel didn't simply leave the end of the two-state solution to a declaration. But it laid over the occupied territory what it calls facts on the ground over the last 47 years that are so massive and so permanent that the two-state solution is gone. In other words, Israel consciously and deliberately, and I think irreversibly, eliminated the two-state solution. And without getting into details, of course, it fragmented completely the Palestinian areas. So the Palestinians have been pushed out of all this gray area. All the gray area is called Area C. The 62% of the occupied territory that's completely controlled by Israel, and that's where the settlements are. See all the blue dots all over. There's 200 settlements. There are 600,000 Israelis living in the occupied territory today. In 4 years, there'll be 1 million Israelis in the occupied territory. And they're living not just the word settlement kind of minimizes the reality. You think of a couple of shacks on the hillside. But in fact, cities like Ma'ale Adunim are 50,000 people. Upper Modi'in is about 80,000 people. One of the neighborhoods in East Jerusalem is about 100,000 people. We're talking about massive satellite cities, not little settlements somewhere. In fact, there are more Israelis living in East Jerusalem than there are Palestinians. And so Israel has basically shoved the Palestinians out of Area C. For example, in 1967, there were 250,000 Palestinians living in the Jordan Valley. Today, there's less than 50,000. And 30,000 of those live in Jericho. So they've been shoved out. The middle classes have been shoved out of the country for the most part. Something like 400,000 Palestinians have left the occupied territory in the last 15 years or so. And overwhelmingly, those are middle class people. And so Israel calls it selective transfer. Because if we can get the middle classes out, the working people, the poor people, the farmers are much easier to control. And then those, the ones that can't leave or that decide not to leave, are then again displaced from Area C and shoved into Areas A and B. Areas A and B, without getting into details, that are supposedly under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, although that's a complete fiction, of course. Areas A and B and Gaza, which is a cage, represent 38% of the occupied territory. So what we can say is that 95% of the Palestinians live on 38% of 22% of their country. And then that is fragmented into about 70 little islands of Areas A and B. I would argue there is no more West Bank. Actually, we should probably stop talking about occupation. Occupation is a temporary military situation. After 47 years and all of this, the West Bank has been incorporated into Israel. You know, I think we should stop talking about the West Bank. There's no more West Bank. There's no West Bank. It's become Judea and Samaria. Israel has Judaized, and that's the concept it uses. We're Judaizing Palestine. We're transforming Palestine into the land of Israel. And in fact, that's pretty much, I think, what's happened. So that, and I can go on, the highway system that completely incorporates the West Bank. So what Israel has really done then is, and of course the wall, the wall, we'll get into that. So what Israel's basically done is eliminate the two-state solution. Whether it's good or not good or fair or doable or whatever, it's gone. It's over. Which means then, if that's the case, it means that Israel has, in fact, what I'm saying, created one country here between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. There's only one authority. Only one authority, which is the Israeli government. The Palestinian Authority isn't really a government with sovereignty and authority. There's only one army. There's only one currency. Whether you're in Ramallah or Gaza or Tel Aviv, everybody's using the shekel, which is all controlled by the Bank of Israel. There's only one water system, one electrical system, one highway system. By any measure, this is already one country, and it's an apartheid state. And this is a word we should be using and not be apologetic for in any way, because it is an apartheid state. What's interesting on my tour over the last year or two or three, is that I'm getting much less pushback from people using the word apartheid. You know, when Jimmy Carter said it, used the A word, it was a whole firestorm. I think people know it's apartheid. One of the problems is that we don't know how to explain why it's apartheid. So we get kind of defensive. But I think apartheid is very easy to explain. It's not a mystical concept. There's an international law against what's called the crime of apartheid. And apartheid is basically defined by two elements. One is separation. That's apart. Apartheid means separateness. When one population separates itself from the others, and then that population creates a permanent institutionalized regime of domination. It's not discrimination. It's not Jim Crow. It isn't something that if we have better laws and we don't discriminate, everyone will be fine. It's the regime that's defined by separation and domination. Those are the laws. That's the logic of it, and so on. And that's certainly the case. I mean, this is certainly the case of Israel over Palestine. So we have a new apartheid state today, and in fact, it even resembles South Africa. South Africa took 11% of its land and created 11 Bantu states. Crazy little countries that really weren't sovereign, they weren't viable, they had no economies, and they were never recognized by the international community. And that left 89% of South Africa then to be free to be a white democracy. It's the same what we have here today. The Palestinians have been shoved into 15% of the country, which is basically areas A and B, including inside Israel. The situation of Palestinian citizens of Israel is no different, really, from that of the occupied territory. They vote, it's true, but their votes are neutralized in the parliament. And they're also, the Palestinians or the Arabs are 20% of Israel's population, and they're confined by law to about 3.5% of the land. Last year, there were 3 times more demolitions inside Israel of Israeli citizens, all of whom are Arabs, of course, than there were in the occupied territory. So that what you have today is Arabs and Palestinians. I mean, Israel uses the term Arabs. It doesn't use the Palestinian because it doesn't want to recognize that collectivity, a national collectivity, and so we say Arabs. But in the sense, the Palestinian Bantustan is on 15% of the country. It's very similar to South Africa, and that leaves 85% of the land of Israel to be free to be a Jewish democracy. Well, it's a very parallel concept. It's true, it's not based on race, like in South Africa, but it doesn't matter. Once you have a regime of separation and domination, it doesn't matter if the basis is race, like South Africa, or nationalism, religion, as it is here, or the color of your eyes. Who cares what the basis is if you have that kind of regime? And so we have an apartheid regime. So it seems to me there's 3 options in this conflict. One, 3 ways out. One is a 2-state solution. but it's gone. The second is apartheid. I mean, this is the solution that Israel is. I mean, we have apartheid today. Israel is exactly where it wants to be. It has apartheid. It has the whole country. It's seen as the only democracy in the Middle East. So it's very good at an apartheid regime able to sell itself as a democracy. That's pretty good. It has the unanimous support of the American Congress. That's its rock solid basis. Plus countries like Canada, Britain, Germany, Holland, and some others, like Egypt. So Israel thinks it's home free. In last summer, in the assault on Gaza, with everything going on in Gaza, more than 2,000 people killed, maybe civilians, 18,000 homes demolished, $4 billion of damage to infrastructure in a place that hardly had any infrastructure. At the height of the assault on Gaza last summer, the Senate passed a resolution supporting Israel. All right, that's not surprising. It would have been revolutionary if that hadn't happened. Well, but the vote, people don't know this. The vote was 100-0 in the Senate. We're talking about Gaza, not, we support Israel in a general way or this or that. Supporting the attack on Gaza. We're talking about Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. I think of the most liberal senators you can think of. 100-0. When the United States declared war on Japan, World War II, it wasn't unanimous. There were a couple dissenting votes. So this is wall to wall. I mean, there's no wedge here. There's no cracks. And that's where Israel says, we won. We won. It's over. It's done. Now we're mopping up. We're building more settlements. And Israel can really thumb its nose at the international community. The European Union decided a couple of years ago, the European Union decided that it was going to build an Area C. In other words, the Palestinian Authority has given up Area C. They don't go there. That's where the demolitions are. Israel's demolished 48,000 Palestinian homes in the occupied territory since 1967. Tens of thousands in Area C. Palestinian Authority doesn't say a word about it. There's no protest, and they don't help the people who've been demolished to rebuild. They've given up Area C. There's no development there. There's no industries. The Palestinian Authority basically confines itself to areas A and B. So the European Union said, we're going to protect the Palestinians in Area C. We're going to ensure some kind of development. So they built some houses for Palestinians in Area C. And last week, Netanyahu announced that 400 houses, 400 Palestinian homes in Area C that were built by the EU are going to be demolished. So, the EU is Israel's largest trading partner. But it can do it because the EU is not going to sanction Israel. Britain won't allow it. Germany won't allow it. The Czech Republic won't allow it. They've got their little, their countries, and it all depends. Sometimes you get a right-wing government in Spain or Denmark or different places. There's no way that Europe could ever sanction Israel. And as long as there's no sanctions, Israel's message is, no, you are not going to touch Area C, EU. And it does the same thing to the American administration. It humiliated Kerry when he came. Kerry came really sincerely. I don't know why he did it, but he did. Well, I have an idea. Doesn't matter. He sincerely tried to get a two-state solution. In one of his visits, he came with 130 advisors. I don't know what you do with 130 advisors, but they really tried. And in the middle of this whole thing, this is the American government
that Israel is completely dependent on. You know, the Moshe Ya'alon, the defense minister, says publicly, I wish Kerry would get his Nobel Peace Prize already and get off our backs. You know, humiliating. I mean, now, this week, I think today or tomorrow, Netanyahu's in Washington at the invitation of the Republicans, completely bypassing the administration, talking to Congress, addressing Congress on what? On Iran. See, so the strategy is, not only have we won in terms of the facts on the ground, creating a Palestinian collaborations regime, neutralizing Europe, neutralizing the administration through Congress, but we can mop up. We don't have to even pretend. So, you know, Israel always tried to present itself as a Jewish democracy, right? That's important to be a democracy, after all. A Jewish democracy, which is kind of a contradiction in terms, obviously. Now, no. Netanyahu is now passing a law that will go through after the next election that Israel is Jewish. Jewish trumps democracy. And Israel has no constitution. So the parliament has that power to instruct the Supreme Court whenever there's a conflict between Jewish values and interests and democratic and human rights laws, Jewish trumps the democratic. And we can do all of this because we don't care anymore. We've won. So Israel thinks it can get away with apartheid in the way that South Africa could. And that's, in a sense, a challenge. You know, first of all, can we fight that? But beyond that, then, it seems to me that where we have to go as a movement, if we want to end this, and end the occupation, and end the whole thing, it seems to me there's only one option. There's only one way out. And that is to go with the flow. To say, okay, Israel created one state. Let's make that clear. Israel eliminated the two-state solution. This isn't an Arab conspiracy. You know, if Israel's not going to be a Jewish state, it's not because anybody else wanted it. It's because Israel decided that it wanted control of the entire country, and you can't have it both ways. You can't be a Jewish state, and probably you couldn't be a Jewish state anyway. That's another issue. But you can't incorporate 4.5 million Palestinians in all the territory and still be Jewish without being an apartheid regime. So it seems to me our task is clear where we have to go. We have to say, we have to take this one state and transform it from an apartheid state into a democratic state of all its citizens. Equal rights for everybody living in the country. Doesn't seem to be I don't see any other option. Why we're not beginning to advocate for that more, I don't quite understand, although I understand the problem, but then it becomes a civil rights movement. You see, and again, a lot of Palestinians are having trouble making that transition. It seems to me that's where we have to go. Now, what does that mean? That's what I just want to take a couple minutes and kind of flesh out. What does that mean? One democratic state. First of all, before we go to a solution, well, I think we have to talk about what elements would go into any just solution. Because I go back to what I was saying before. There's a tendency among Palestinian activists to say, look, we can't formulate an alternative solution right now. We don't have the mechanisms, we don't have the agreement, we can't do that. And therefore, what we should be doing as Palestinians is blocking out what are our basic human rights, what are our national rights, what do we want, and then that provides the parameters around which a solution can be built. it's kind of like almost a default kind of a thing. In other words, anything that's proposed by Israel, by the PA, by the international community, by the UN, by whoever, is evaluated according to does it conform to those rights and needs that we Palestinians have blocked out. That tends to be more of the approach than advocating for a particular approach. But, and in a sense, I think if I was going to contribute to that, I'm in a delicate situation. I'm not Palestinian, on the contrary. So I can't come out and advocate for a solution. That's the Palestinians' prerogative, and we have to respect that. But I am a stakeholder. I live in the country, and I've certainly been active for many years. So I have a right to be a catalyst of discussion, to try to move the discussion forward. So it's a very delicate line, but that's what I'm trying to do. So I blocked out what I consider 6 essential elements of any solution. In other words, if any one of these is missing, no solution's going to work. I don't care how good it looks on paper. And on the contrary, these I think set those parameters so that if there's a lot of different possibilities. There could be confederations. There could be all kinds of possibilities that should be evaluated through this filter. This is like the filter. And if that solution genuinely addresses these needs, or if it can be tinkered with, so that it will conform to these, it could be okay. Essential elements to a solution. And just quickly, these I think are the elements. The first one is one of the hardest. Because the idea of a one-state solution with individual rights for everybody is fine. Nobody has a problem with that. Well, I mean, Israelis have a problem with that, obviously. It wouldn't be a Jewish state. But for Palestinians, in fact, there is what's called the One Democratic State movement. There is that. Mazen Qamsi is one of the heads of it. They have a website. But they're fudging it. They're fudging it because they're only dealing with individual rights. And they're ignoring the national part, as if we're all voters in Arizona or something, So if you look at their website, if you look at the charter of the One Democratic State movement, it's entitled One Democratic State in Palestine. Well, what does that mean? If you're an Israeli, you certainly ask, what does that mean? Does that mean Palestine as a neutral designation of the country? Or does it mean Palestine? In which case, where am I? So you see, that's the problem. If you jump to a solution and you're laying out these things and you haven't had this discussion, so you don't know, are there hidden agendas? Am I missing something? Is this genuine? Everything has to be transparent. We have to fight out the elements. And once we do that and we get on the same page, then all kinds of solutions are possible. But if you jump to a solution without filling in those gaps, it actually generates more conflict and more distrust than it resolves. The problem it's almost an opposite problem. You see, the Palestinians say yes, there should be equal rights for everybody in the country. They have a problem with collective rights. The idea of a binational state. Because if in fact Zionism was a settler colonial movement, and it was to Palestinians certainly, then to ask me to accept the collective rights of Israeli Jews is a kind of a soft Zionism. You're asking me to legitimize a colonial movement. You see, and I'm not going to go there. So that's where I get pushback. I think the Palestinians have to bite that bullet at some point. But I don't see a way out of it. But it's the opposite for Israelis. Israelis could be convinced to have one state with collective rights, kind of a two-state solution. Now there's a new kind of a solution that's being talked about by some very good people. Meron Rappaport, Oren Yiftachel, and it's called something like, what's it called? I can't remember what it's called exactly, but the idea is, let's have one state, it's very convoluted. Let's have one state, but two political entities, two separate parliaments, two separate citizenships. It doesn't, but everybody lives in the same country. It gets kind of, but where it really breaks down, I was at a meeting they had a few weeks ago, is you get to security. Everything is fine, we're all living together, we're all, but security stays in the hands of Israel for 50 years. So that ends that for your policy. I mean, you know, I'm not gonna, I mean, that's what I mean by plans that seem good, but if you all of a sudden, you know, you slip in something like that completely wrecks it. So Israel, but what I'm saying is Israelis might be convinced to go to a two-state solution, or even that kind of a weird thing I was talking about of collective rights, but not individual rights, because equal individual rights mix Jews and Palestinians, and that they don't want to do. You know, they want the collective. So I think you have to have both. It was easier for me talking about this in Canada, because Canada has that system. In Canada, it's one Canada, but you've got Anglophones and Francophones. The French-speaking in Canada are a separate political, linguistic, cultural group. The province of Quebec has its own parliament. It's a little bit like Scotland, you know, in the UK. It has its own parliament. It controls its own immigration policies. It has its own special economy. It has French-speaking universities, French-speaking newspapers, all kinds. So it has self-determination. The French in Canada have a good amount of self-determination, but it falls short of independence. The Catalonians and the Basques in Spain, you know, the Scots and the Welsh in the UK. These are all groups that have a national existence and rights of self-determination, but that fall short of the state. So this is, I think, what we have to work out. Can we develop the idea of a state in which there's a democratic, everybody has equal rights, everybody can live everywhere, everybody's equal, completely. The same citizenship, the same passport. You know, I have a joke. What would we call the country? There's no agreed upon name. What would be inclusive? No, only I can tell this story. I'm Jewish. You could call the state Palestine if you spelled Stein, S-T-E-I-N. But anyway, what I'm saying is you have equal rights in that country, but also the collective rights of each of the national groups has to be acknowledged and built in, of Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. We can't sweep that under the carpet. And but it's something good to get out, talk about. At any rate, that's one principle. Obviously, any solution has to conform to human rights international law. That's what levels the playing field for Palestinians. Without that, everything is power politics and they lose. The third, of course, is the hardest for Israelis. The right of return. The right of return is absolute. It has to be, and there's no discussion about it. There has to be the right of return, which is a right. I mean, it's not like somebody's doing the Palestinians a favor. But that's part of it, acknowledging the right of return. But there also has to be an acknowledgement of what Israel did in 1948. because otherwise reconciliation can't and healing can't go on. Every time somebody denies the Holocaust, Jews go bananas. And rightly so, because victims need their suffering, the injustice done to them acknowledged. That has to be in order for the healing to take place. So that we can't have just a technical resolution. This acknowledgement has to be a part of it. And that's not going to be easy. But that's what would allow reconciliation. And then the refugees have a choice. They can come back, they can stay where they are with compensation, they can have compensation in another country. And the land issue is very interesting. There was a conference of Zochrot last year. Zochrot is an Israeli organization dedicated to remembering the Nakba and actually planning the return. And there's a Palestinian, you probably know, researcher, I think it's in Washington, Salman Abu Sita, who writes that he's done research that 85% of the lands that were taken from the Palestinians in 1948 are still available. They haven't been built upon. They're either agricultural lands or they're under parks. So there could be an actual return to a lot of the lands. And in other words, the right of return is a possible thing. It has to be economically viable, the solution. And I put that on because South Africa, as we know, got political independence, but not economic independence. It's still in debt to the World Bank and the IMF. And of course, the Black African community hasn't been able to really get out from being an underclass. So that's important. And here I think there's a big element that's missing in the analysis, and that's the Palestinian diaspora. Palestinian diaspora is very rich, especially in Latin America, where they run the place. In Latin America, it's very fascist too, by the way. It's the same thing, you say, how can Jews do this after what they went through? You look at the Palestinians in Latin America, and they were the supporters of Pinochet, and they were the death squads in El Salvador, and they were behind the coup in Honduras. I mean, that's a whole other story. But nevertheless, they have a lot of the Palestinian diaspora is very educated, very affluent, and they would kick in. So the Palestinians have a huge advantage going into this that I think would prevent them from becoming an underclass. Then you have to address the security concerns of everybody, and that's certainly in the Middle East we're living in. That's in the whole region. And ultimately, this seems almost ridiculous today, given what's going on, but there has to be a regional approach. And everybody that's dealt with development work in the so-called third world knows that you have to have regional, even regional development. So even if Israel-Palestine finds a peace, and Israelis and Palestinians are living wonderfully together, and the whole country is flourishing, but you're in a region that's unstable and violent and autocratic and poor, it's not going to work. You can't develop a little fortress, Israel-Palestine, a gated Israel-Palestine net. So any solution is, in the end, is going to have to deal with the whole region. And here, I think the Palestinians play a key role, because the Palestinians are really the gatekeepers in many ways. They're emblematic for most people in the Arab and Muslim worlds, and even beyond. This little people that's been fighting, Western neocolonialism and imperialism and militarism and occupation all these decades. So if they begin to say, okay, we've resolved our issue, now we have to go on to the second stage, which is really bringing development and prosperity and equality to the whole region, which is one reason why the conservative Arab states are afraid of the Palestinians. That would resonate tremendously in the region. So once the Palestinians can break free of this and begin to look at the wider region, I think they have a tremendous role to play. So let me just say one more quick thing and then I'll go, because I even kind of played with this a little bit more. What would this look like? If we get through these elements, what would one state actually look like? I mean, it's good, even if we don't agree. I mean, it's good to kind of begin to talk about this stuff. The fancy word in political science and international relations is a consociational state, which basically means sharing. And research has shown that this is the best approach after conflicts, when there's no trust between communities, because you build a system in which everybody has ownership, everybody's collectively acknowledged, and everybody is sharing the system. So if the system isn't good for one group, it's not good for anyone. So basically, again, I would make the whole state a very technocratic state. If you're in America, if you're in most states, the state is the repository of your identity. If I ask you if you're an American, who are you? You can be different religions, different ethnicities, different this and that, but the answer is, I'm an American. You take out what's on your passport is who you are. But we don't have that in Israel Palestine. There is no agreed upon identity. Even in apartheid South Africa, there was an agreed upon it. We're all South Africans, and now we have a system that lets us all be South. We don't have that here. So one of the best models that I think is around is Switzerland. Switzerland is a country, and why do you have to have a state? I don't like states, but the international system is built of states. You have to have something. But in Switzerland, the different linguistic communities are stronger than this common Swiss identity. They want to be German speakers, Italian speakers, French speakers. They live in their cantons and their communities. But those communities are too small to be viable in the international system, so they had to come together into a Switzerland. But a Switzerland is very technocratic. It isn't your identity. No, you can't tell me, nobody knows who the Prime Minister of Switzerland is. You can tell me probably who the Prime Minister of France is, and Britain, Germany. Switzerland? And Switzerland doesn't have a Prime Minister. It has a president. And in fact, it has 7 presidents because they rotate from canton to canton to canton. So you can have a technocratic state that simply administrates, but doesn't really capture the identity of the people. Then within that, just in a word, I would look at 2 houses, a parliament with 2 houses. And I kind of took this leaf out of what New Zealand does with the Maori. In other words, in this system consociational system, I'm saying that there's 2 houses to parliament. One is a normal parliament. I mean, here you call it a Congress. In Canada and most countries, it's a parliament. A normal parliament where you have elections, everybody votes, normal kind of a thing like that. But there'd be a second house of parliament that's based on the national communities in the country. In other words, you've got 2 national communities in that country. You have Palestinian Arabs and you have Israeli Jews. And so you would vote for, the parties, the figures, the issues of your community, and that would go into another house of parliament. The basic principle being checks and balances. That neither house could pass legislation affecting the other community without its consent. You see, so you build in acknowledgement. First of all, we're acknowledging the existence of these. They have collective rights. They have rights to exist. It doesn't matter if 90% of the country becomes Palestinian and 10% is Israeli in the end. It doesn't threaten any, or the other way around, it doesn't threaten anybody like it does in Lebanon, which is based on dividing rather than sharing. It doesn't threaten because your collective rights are assured no matter what your population is. So you don't have to count babies, you don't have to have equality, you have to be afraid. Your collective rights are assured regardless. You're in the parliament, your voice is heard, you're acknowledged, and you're protected. You see, and in that way, you could have the communities existing and so on, and you would have, but you could also have a normal parliament. And what's happening in Switzerland, I'll end on this, which is interesting. What's actually happening in Switzerland is the young people are getting out of these Camden identities. The young people are feeling more, not just Swiss, they're feeling more European. So you have a lot of universities in Switzerland that are multilingual. You know, you've got cities that are multilingual. You've got, the friendships, marriages, so that this kind of a system wouldn't lock you into a community. If your community is important and you're a part of that, you can be a part of that and be a citizen. But over time, it could be that the young people will start to leave these, or these will weaken to some degree, and people will start to identify with whatever wider society exists, which could be a good thing as well. So I think, and the only, I'm just throwing this out, it's just not the solution, but it's kind of trying to deal with some of the issues. But I think it is possible to think about political arrangements that address the needs of the peoples of Israel and Palestine. And that's part of our responsibility. Because if we want to be actors, we've got to do that. We have to put our views and our positions and our plans and our visions into the pot. And so that's why I'm kind of suggesting this. So talk to for what it's worth. So now we get to have discussion, questions, arguments.
Thank you very much. I was just going to have anyone who wants to ask questions.
This
Sir?
young student over here.
One of the problems I see is the current policy of ethnic cleansing that Israel has, and has had since 1948. And now, as we see now with Netanyahu's recent recruiting from France, Belgium, and Netherlands, more obviously bringing more Jewish people into the country.
Well, now, obviously, it's an either or. There's a war between the peoples. And it's either them or us. That's the way Netanyahu, of course, phrases it. And if you're an Israeli, it's going to be us. And so, and I'm just suggesting another way of presenting this. And here's another task of progressive people that, especially Palestinians, that want to move this forward. If we really do want to get to a just peace, the ANC, the African National Congress in South Africa, the ANC had a freedom charter before the end of apartheid. And the freedom charter was like a constitution. When de Klerk came and all of a sudden, boom, it collapsed. The ANC was ready. They even had a constitution, and they were able to jump in. They didn't do too well economically, but politically they were ready. But the reason it could happen was in the Freedom Charter, they said our vision of the new South Africa after apartheid is multiracial. That was their term. In other words, it's inclusive of everybody. And obviously the white population, especially the Afrikaners, would never have gone along with the transition if there hadn't been that assurance. It's not fair that the oppressed have to assure the oppressors that they'll be safe if the oppression ends. But that's the way it is. Otherwise, the oppressors aren't going to give up power. So once they saw that an inclusive South Africa was possible, the whites were able to go along with the transition. They wouldn't have done it themselves. Wouldn't have been, they never would have gotten up and overthrown apartheid on their own. But with that inclusiveness of the Freedom Charter, they grumbled, but they saw there was no point in trying to fight for apartheid. It was over, it was gone. And I think that's the case here. If Palestinians, with critical Israeli partners like us, if we would sit down and formulate a kind of a freedom charter, what is our vision? What are our principles? Where are we going? Not in detail, but in this general kind of a way. And we can come up with something that's somehow inclusive. I mean, our equivalent of multiracial would be binational. If we could come up with that, I think when the de Klerk moment comes, and it could be coming, I think this collapse is happening. I think you could bring the Israeli Jews into the equation. I don't think there would be necessarily this us and them. You could break them. Like I said, for Israeli Jews, for them, they have to know that their collective rights are protected. Without that, they're not going to go anywhere. But if this can be, if we can agree on this or find a formulation that we can then present to the peoples of the country, I think that provides that basis for moving ahead together towards thinking about a solution.
I have actually two questions, sort of in one, I guess you could say. So you talked about apartheid and the comparison between South Africa and Israel. And I was wondering exactly what your definition of apartheid is, because my understanding of apartheid is you have a majority with no rights, absolutely no rights, and then you have a minority with all rights. And you talked earlier about how Palestinians have the right to vote in Israel, but their vote is just kind of drowned out, but they still have the right to vote. I mean, there's Palestinians in the Knesset, there's Palestinians on the Supreme Court. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, you had that also in South Africa. You had a population called colored and Asian, and you had certain populations that had kind of a vote. They were different from the black Africans. There were all kinds of variations. But it's like I say, from my point of view, apartheid is those two elements that I mentioned: separation and domination. And it doesn't so much matter in a way the minority-majority thing. In fact, Israel, that's the problem, is that the Jews in Israel are in a much stronger position than the whites were in South Africa. The whites were, 10% of the population, 15% of the population of the country. So how could they deny this vast majority of their rights? Israel is still 50%. The Israeli Jews are still not quite 50, but because there's other things there, but Israelis are sort of 50%. So they're feeling much stronger. But nevertheless, I think it's the same principle. And that is that you can't have a regime of domination. So in South Africa, when apartheid ended, it wasn't some technical thing. Okay, now blacks can vote. That wasn't it. The whole country was reinvented. You had a whole new constitution. The whole idea was South Africa now belongs to all of us. And not all the black Africans agreed. I mean, Winnie Mandela didn't agree with the ANC policy that said we should be multiracial. I'm not trying to present it that the ANC was unanimous. There were voices that said, no, we don't want whites to stay here, or we don't want to be there were all kinds of voices, but the majority of the ANC adopted the multiracial idea, and that's what in the end carried the day. So I think in Israel, I think there's going to be a lot of disagreement in Israel-Palestine, and good conversation. But out of that comes a very healthy. You've kind of worked it out. You talked about it. You're on the same page. You have a good you had a public discussion, and that provides a basis for going on. So that's what I'm trying to get at, is that we should, and we're not having any conversations at all. The Palestinians aren't having it internally. The Israeli peace movement's not having it internally. We're not talking to each other very much. So that's kind of missing that. Do you want to, did I?
Well, I had two questions. The second question would be, I understand perfectly you're talking about a peace, and it actually seems like a really good idea in principle. But that assumes that there are actors on the Palestinian side that want Israel as a Jewish nation to exist, which there's a lot of rhetoric that says otherwise.
No, I know that, and the Palestinians have to have their discussions about that as well. If I can, one problem is, I think that with our Palestinian partners, is that there's always a kind of a tension between what's happening, the realities on the ground. Because in the end, you want to resolve the conflict. You gotta, and your ideology and what you want. And there's always a kind of going back and forth between them. But on the issue of Palestine, there has been no political process for years. So for the intellectuals, their analysis kind of is broken free of anything political. It's free floating. And you're students, a lot of you, so you know that, the logic leads you in all kinds of places, but especially I think this discussion of settler colonialism. For Palestinian Zionism was settler colonialism. That's true. But if you simply follow that logic, it doesn't lead you anywhere in terms of how you're actually going to resolve the conflict unless you throw the Israelis out, Israeli Jews out, which is possible. After that, I mean, Nelson Mandela's answer to Winnie Mandela, who was the leader of the idea that this should be a black country, was, and the whites were simply colonists, was that we maybe do that, we'd have the power to do that, but it would tear our society apart. In other words, there are such connections and there's issues of, it was like with Algeria, it was easy in a way. I mean, the French had been there for 150 years. They were pretty, but the French could go back to France. Where are the whites in South Africa going to go back to? They don't have a mother country anymore. They've been there for 300 years. And where would the Jews go back to? Can't go back to, where do they go to? Poland? I mean, where? So that's one of the issues. You would be creating another injustice on top of an injustice, and is that really the way you want to build your society? So it seems to me that you're not going to get to absolute justice in either direction. And the problem with the settler colonial discourse that I understand and I even participate in is that in the end, it's not leading you to a constructive place. Because it's really saying, well, I can't, if it's settler colonialism, I can't deal with collective rights of Israelis. But if you don't do that, you're not going to get a just solution. So that's, I think, part of the problem is how do we have this kind of a discussion? And one of the ideas of settler colonialism is a fellow who has a journal about that in Australia, who says, well, settler colonialism doesn't necessarily mean, self-determination doesn't necessarily mean a state of your own. It can be, like I've said, you can have those rights and nevertheless find those rights, a good modicum of self-determination within a single state.
Thank you very much for speaking today. I read a really interesting article during our first event last year about the Saudi-Israel relationship, and I've heard some other rumblings about if the Arab countries are collaborating with Israel in this occupation in some regard. What do you think of those allegations?
I'd like to see that, Russell's article. But I haven't seen it. Yeah, I mean, I'm writing a book about that now. It's a book about what I call security politics. Because I'm looking also out. I'm looking at Israel's exporting of the occupation. And what I call global Palestine is that, there's a globalization of Palestine. Palestine is a microcosm of what's going on. Palestine is a laboratory to some degree for weapons development, security systems, and all of that Israel exports. It's a big part of its economy. But it's also not just an economy, it also gives you a lot of clout, political clout. If you're a major military power, Israel's the fourth largest nuclear power. It's the fourth largest arms exporter. Israel exports more arms than Britain or China. Nobody's going to catch up with the United States. You're the champs, but Israel's up there. And that gives a tremendous clout, including, and what I'm saying is that security politics, if you bring in the military aspect, all of a sudden a whole different constellation comes about. So we often talk about the Israel-Arab conflict. And certainly Saudi Arabia and Israel seem like diametrically opposed parties on a normal international relations ideological level. What in the hell would they ever have in common? But if you bring in the military, turns out that Israel has, take out the Palestinians, you have an identical foreign policy agenda between Israel and the conservative Arab regimes. As a matter of fact, they're afraid of the Palestinians. And Saudi Arabia has given Israel permission to fly over its territory to attack Iran. And Israel's involved, the Gulf states have economic offices in Tel Aviv. I mean, a lot of it's not so hidden. Saudi Arabia, it's a little more hidden. It's a lot more hidden. But if you look at, it's interesting, the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, of the entire Arab League, saying to Israel, if you give up the occupation, we'll integrate you into the region. We'll even make you a member of the Arab League. Whoa. Was the Saudis formulated that? I mean, of all the Arab countries, all right, you can say, okay, Mubarak would do it. He's close to Israel. But, the Saudis? So if you take the military part, it turns out that the Saudis and Israelis, I think, are very close. And I think the subtext of the Arab Peace Initiative was, we want you, Israel, to be a regional hegemon. We want your military on our side. What's ours? Our side is the conservative regimes of these countries. We want you to help us deal with our internal dissent. We want you to help us deal with the Shiites. We want you to help us, and we want you, Israel's a gatekeeper to the United States. We want you to help us get American support and American arms and all those sorts of things. So if you put that in fact, Israel is a very close ally, I would think, Saudi Arabia. Arms bypasses ideologies, especially for men. All the toys they have. When Colin Powell was the Secretary of State, he went to, I don't know if he went to Syria or anyway, he met with the Syrian Chief of Staff. This is before the Civil War, of course. The head of the Syrian military, and they were talking about, and he said, the head of the Syrian military said, before I retire, I'd love to visit the Israeli war room. See how they organize it. I'd love to fly in an Israeli F-16. So they're not talking ideology, these guys. It's an old boys network of military people and people that profit from arms. So I'm writing about that now, but I think that's a very important piece of this equation, that if we can get to a just peace where the Palestinians and progressive Israelis become stronger, you know, we can introduce a more progressive voice into the Middle East and get past a lot of this alienation and warfare and so on than we can today. So.
Okay, this is going to be a couple parts again at the question. I've been following Netanyahu's proposal to speak and Boehner's invitation. And I've also been following the backlash to that, and I know that there are at least 26 people who are members of Congress who are going to be boycotting that.
Democrats.
Democrats. And that there is a movement to try to prevent, or to get other people to support that boycott. So a lot of people are sending letters to Congress to try to have that happen.
And the Democrats have always been more pro-Israel than the Republicans.
Yeah, well, that's a different thing. At any rate, one of the things that has happened, the result of that, is that I've been hearing from certain Israeli friends that they're angry that Netanyahu is pulling this trick for political reasons, and you're hearing the same thing. So we're on the same page with that, but I think people need to hear that here. The second part of this is that I received an email of an interview with one of the leaders of the Baladi party inside Israel. And one of his comments in that interview was that although his party is basically in favor of the one-state solution, that they are making ties with parties
The other Arab parties.
that believe in a two-state solution because it's practical to do so. I'd like you to comment on that.
No, the two-state solution is still alive in the Arab community. Again, I say Arab because in Israel, that's what they call themselves. You know, Balad, it was a party of Azmi Bashar, is a nationalist Palestinian party. In other words, it says the Palestinians should be recognized as a national minority in Israel. He's basically saying, you know, the Balad is basically saying, you have to recognize our collective rights inside Israel today, which Israel doesn't do. But Hadash, which is the Communist Party, basically, it's always been a two-state party. The head of Hadash was even a signatory on the Declaration of Independence of Israel. So they're very much for two states still. And they've united, sort of united, not really. But because there was a change in the law, Victor Lieberman, you know, the right-wing racist Russian guy, who's the foreign minister, wanted to eliminate the Arab parties. So you have in Israel a threshold. You know, in Israel, you don't vote for candidates. You vote for parties. So if a party didn't get more than 1% of the vote, it couldn't get in. So what he did, and the Arab parties were always fairly close because they were four of them. And so and half the Palestinians inside Israel voted for Israeli, if you want to put it this way, Zionist parties. The Labour Party or Meretz. Meretz has a Palestinian member of Knesset, and so does Labour. And then the other half of the Palestinians voted for four parties. So they barely got in. They had, you know, 120 members of parliament, each one had 4 or 5 seats. So what Lieberman did was he got the parliament to raise the threshold to 3%, which would mean the Arab parties wouldn't pass and there wouldn't be Arabs in the parliament. And so what they did, the 4 parties, was they united. They united. They're running as one joint list. And they could get, it depends, between 12 and 15 seats. So they could be a certain part of the equation, although in Israel there's a concept of a Jewish minority. So even if the Arabs vote, even if they get a block, they're not going to be brought into the government. Their votes are neutralized. And all the coalitions are between the Jewish parties. And the whole thing is so racist, you wouldn't believe it. But anyway. But the Arab, nevertheless, they all united. But the question is, and they united again, but their ideologies aren't united. One of them is an Islamicist party. There's an Islam party, there's an Islamic party, there's a national Palestinian party, there's a two-state party, and there's TB, who's kind of himself. And very close to Abu Mazen. So what that means after the elections, I don't know if it's really going to make a difference, but the fact that they could have a good block is going to complicate things. It won't really. I mean, Netanyahu is going to win. And there's going to be a more right-wing government. And in that constellation, of course, the Arabs won't really doesn't mean anything. Maybe we'll take one more and then we'll call it a night.
Me?
Of course.
Yeah, well, I want to say I really admire your work. And it just, how would you envision that the name of that state would be?
Palestine. No, I don't know what it would be called really. I mean, Palestine, Israel, Israel, Palestine, it's sort of a little awkward. But there is a country in the world that's called Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is even more awkward. So, you know, it's not the worst. I don't know. Maybe come up Orangeville or I don't know. And what would the flag be like? I mean, it would be, I mean, let me leave it at this. And that is that I think the one-state idea is actually a real challenge. I think it's, I don't want to say fun, not a fun situation, but it's always challenging and to be creative and to think of new ideas. And here, you know, in many ways, let me just end on this. In many ways, Israelis and Palestinians are much closer than often we think. Maybe more the Palestinians, it's true, than the Israelis. But I was in Gaza. You know, the boats going into Gaza, trying to go in. I was on the first boats, 2008, and we actually got in. I was the only Israeli to get into Gaza, and we were in. And I came in as an Israeli. And a lot of the Palestinians there, 40,000 people came out to meet our boats. We were the first boats into Gaza in 40 years. On the one hand, we were protected because, if something had happened to us, that wouldn't have been so good. But we were never in danger. But on the other hand, we tried very much to meet people. So here I am, 10 o'clock at night, in the middle of Gaza City, and there's no electricity. Because no electricity, so big parts of of Gaza are blackened at night. So I'm sitting outside in a coffee shop, maybe 100, 200 people around in Gaza. We're all talking Hebrew. And the whole thrust of the conversation, it wasn't political in a way. It wasn't one state, two states. The whole thrust of the conversation, and there were no journalists around, so nobody was acting a role or something. The whole tone of the conversation in the dark, in the middle of the night in Gaza, was, how do we get out of this mess? That's really what it was. And the we was a kind of a normal we. Why can't I go work in Tel Aviv? Why can't you bring your kids to the beach in Gaza? I mean, that's really, I was very encouraged by that. Because I could hear people say, okay, we gotta live with you fucking Israelis. It's a real politique, and what can we do? And no, the whole thing was the other way around. Let's live together. Now, how do we build something that lets us do that? So I'm saying there is on the ground a basis for that. One of the slogans of the left is we refuse to be enemies. So that there is a certain basis, and maybe I'll leave you with that because
I don't think I think we could have this conversation. And we can really disagree and have a good, strong conversation, because I think we're all committed to finding a way out of this mess. So thank you guys a lot.